If you're a 20-something here today, let's see all the 20-somethings. I'd like to tell you something you may already think and feel about your future, and I'd like to begin with a story. In Quebec in the 1930s, there was a well-respected sea captain who was very unusual. Captain Larson was unusual because he was an English-speaking immigrant living in a French-speaking community. He was unusual because he was much older than the other men working on the river at the time, and he was unusual because he had a job with a stable wage. It was the Great Depression and a time of great change. Wages had plunged, and the unemployment rate was about 30%. Many families weren't as lucky, and many men who worked on the river simply didn't return. Now, although Captain Larson had a stable wage, he knew if his family was going to survive the Depression, they were going to have to be innovative, and they were going to have to be creative. The other families living in Captain Larson's quarter were very diverse. Young, old, immigrant, non-immigrant, different dialects, different cultures, different religions, different politics. And although they were all, in a sense, competing to survive, he knew if their families were going to make it through that defining decade, they were going to have to welcome each other and then find a way to connect and collaborate. So Captain Larson devised a plan. He would keep his ship on the water very late in the season, longer than any other. He would travel as far up and down the river as he could, in search of more news and more information about how the future looked for his generation and his children. And when the captain returned his ship to port, he would sound his ship's horn, deep and resonating. And local families looking for news and information and uncertain about the future would pay him a visit. Now, the captain spoke only broken French, but his eldest daughter, Grace, was smart and had a talent for languages. She had learned French and some of the local dialects. So when the captain's ship was in port, Grace sat at his side, listening, often translating as he spoke, telling visitor after visitor the stories he'd collected about life up and down the river, and his thoughts about what the newspapers said. They did some of their best thinking together, and though they never spoke of their feelings, her love for him grew and grew. So when the captain returned to his ship, Grace found it especially hard. She never let it show. He was strict and serious, and as one of the only families of stable means living in their quarter, he wanted his children to behave with modesty and humility. They were not to appear entitled or selfish. It affects everything, he told them. During the months that the captain was at sea, Grace's only connection to him was to the sound of his ship's horn. Whenever she could, she went to the docks to listen for his ship as it traveled up and down the river. On the day she was married, June 28, 1941, the captain was at sea. He'd heard news of her wedding date and decided if they were going to connect, they would need a plan that was innovative and creative. So Captain Larson devised a plan. After their ceremony, Grace and her new husband would drive to the banks of the river, near to where the captain's ship was anchored. He stood on his ship several hundred meters from shore, and they on the side of the road. At 4 o'clock, he sounded his ship's horn, deep and resonating. And Grace, filled with joy and pride, honked right back. To any observer, it was an ordinary moment. But for Grace, it was the very first and only time she was sure the captain knew not just what she was thinking, but how she was feeling, too. Many years later, when I graduated from university, Grace told me she was as uncertain for my generation of 20-somethings as she'd been for hers. Think long and hard about your future, she said. It affects everything. Grace's generation needed to do their best thinking just to survive. But my generation and my students' generation, we want to do more than our best thinking work. We want to feel passionate about it too. But in this time of great change, with more graduates competing for jobs than ever before, I began to worry for my students. Would passion be possible? Could they do their best thinking work and their best feeling work too? Well, if you're a 20-something today, people have a lot to say about the uncertainty of your future and two very discouraging things about who you are. First, that this generation of 20-somethings is entitled or selfish. And second, that this generation of 20-somethings is indecisive, or worse, ambivalent. This generation has been labeled the me generation, narcissistic, fame-obsessed, self-focused. Their exploration has been called procrastination. They've been told they lack purpose, determination, and a plan. In the workplace, they've been accused of not accepting the way things are done and of challenging the status quo. While the global workplace is changing rapidly as different generations come together with unique strengths, and these historic changes are all happening while 20-somethings experience the most revolutionary neurological changes of their lifetime and the most transformative personal development of their lives. I wonder why we so frequently question their capability. Some of the latest research on brain development suggests that how much we think and feel could in fact be a generational thing. When Grace was growing up, the term emerging adult didn't exist, and human brain development research was still quite new. Scientists believe that the brain stopped growing shortly after puberty, but we now know that the brain continues to develop well into the 20s and isn't fully developed until about age 25. The 20-something brain of today has been described as both grown up and not quite grown up. And some scientists argue that this correlates perfectly with the ambivalence of this generation. But this is a crucial decade of work. It's the one that has the greatest impact on the rest of our careers. It's the life-defining decade where we begin to make our most important decisions, such as where we'll live, who we'll marry or partner with, and whether or not we'll have children. And the brain is making decisions too, strengthening our most important neurological connections and discarding others. But what's more, this is actually the time when the brain's thinking and feeling abilities peak together and then begin to slow. So perhaps one of the unique strengths of 20-somethings is that they can be both rational and emotional, not ambivalent about which one to be. We sometimes forget that at the very moment we expect 20-somethings to choose a major, find a job, and start a career, most of them have already developed diverse interests and skills. They already work multiple jobs requiring multiple talents, and the meaning they make out of their lived experiences are not solitary acts of thinking, but meaningful acts that are felt and accessed immediately by their friends, their families, their colleagues, their connections. The choices they make require their best thinking and feeling work and already affect everything. When I ask my students about the future, here's what they say. They are certain of who they want to be: confident, successful, supportive. They want work relationships that are honest, open, and empowering. And they want organizations that empower them to create new knowledge, new creativity, and new innovation, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of society, of humanity, and the world. In our workplaces today, we are getting better at thinking together, but we're still feeling alone. Too often, we're afraid of what we'll lose in our classrooms and our organizations if we lead with our thoughts and our feelings. Too often, we strip our ideas of emotion until we're sure others have acknowledged our thinking. We call it job security, and I think it comes at the expense of personal fulfillment and organizational success, too. This age of information and the global economy have given most of us open access to knowledge, creativity, and innovation. Our ability to communicate across languages and cultures, across time zones and technologies, is no longer defined by the strengths of the individual, but instead by the unique strengths of each individual generation. And I believe that this generation is as engaged and committed as Grace's and mine. They are willing to work. They just know there are better ways of working. They say they do their best thinking for organizations when they feel emotionally connected to the workplace. Organizations and leaders who think and feel have given us some of the most important acts of knowledge, creativity, and innovation. Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft. Their founders were all between the ages of 20 and 25, and we need more. In the next few years, this generation of 20-somethings will represent about 25% of the workforce. By 2020, 20-somethings will represent about 50% of the global workforce, a workforce they'll share with their parents and their grandparents. Now, this diversity advantage is one of the 21st century's most important and most defining business trends. But there's another trend that's just as important. It's what the captain knew and what Grace felt. And if you ask my students, it's what they'd say. If we're going to build new knowledge, new creativity, and new innovation in this time of great change, then we need workplaces where each individual generation is not only welcome, but welcome to do their very best thinking and their very best feeling too. It will affect everything. Thank you.